Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Steve Cannane. Coming up, the Japanese quake and tsunami disaster sparks fear of a nuclear meltdown. Should the West impose a no-fly zone over Libya? And why the federal police used tear gas on detainees at Christmas Island. Our panel tonight, former New South Wales Labor MP Meredith Burgmann, science journalist and philosopher Tim Dean, and in Canberra, regular contributor to the Drum website Glenn Milne. The nation of Japan is in shock, struggling to deal with the enormity of the earthquake and tsunami disaster and the nuclear emergency that's still unfolding. In the latest developments, about 2,000 bodies have been found on the shore in the worst-hit area of Miyagi Prefecture, and officials fear the final death toll could be more than 10,000. And there's been another explosion at the Fukushima nuclear power plant damaged by Friday's quake. The blast at the number 3 reactor is reported to have injured 11 people. And joining us now from Tokyo is ABC reporter Hayden Cooper. Hayden, what can you tell us about the explosion at the Fukushima plant?
Look, it happened earlier today, Steve. In some ways it was expected. In fact, the chief government spokesman said last night that it could happen. Well, it did. The fortunate thing is that the authorities are saying that it doesn't pose a major risk to human life. Now, the thing blew up. It sent a whole lot of smoke and radioactive material in the air, but apparently it wasn't so serious that people should be worried. They say that the reactor core is still protected inside its containment chamber, which is the main thing, and therefore that's why they've given a fairly optimistic outlook. But having said that, they were still saying to the 600 or so people who are still inside that 20-kilometre evacuation zone that they should stay indoors. So it is still a pretty terrible development when you consider the way this has happened, that 3 or 4 days after the quake and tsunami, they are still unable to get this plant at Fukushima under control.
Hayden, is there any sense of how many people may have been exposed to radioactive smoke and radioactive steam that have been coming from these nuclear reactors?
In the case of today's explosion, about 6 or 7 workers were injured. Now, in the case of the whole last few days since the actual earthquake, there have been reports of a couple of hundred people who have been treated for exposure, but we don't really know yet if there are many more than that. It could well turn out to be the case. An interesting side note this afternoon was that there are reports that the USS aircraft carrier Ronald Reagan, which is off the coast of Japan, actually went through a cloud of radioactive material that was drifting as a result of this explosion. And there have since been reports that the American fleet here to help has actually moved a little bit further offshore. So they're the sorts of things we're dealing with, but I think it's still a bit too early to say with any conviction how many people will need treatment or, for that matter, were exposed.
Hayden, amidst all the tragedies surrounding the tsunami, the earthquake and now this nuclear meltdown, there have been incredible stories of survival, and one has stood out in particular, and that is the story of a man in his 60s who was found 15 kilometres offshore.
It's amazing, isn't it? This guy apparently jumped on his roof as the tsunami approached. His house was smashed to smithereens like many other houses up on the northeast coast, but he clung on for dear life and eventually was rescued out in the ocean. It really is a remarkable story. Now, a few days on, we are starting to learn exactly what happened. There are some tales of survival, some very remarkable tales of survival, but unfortunately there are many more devastating stories about what actually happened on Friday and the impact on human life. Today, for example, something like 2,000 bodies were discovered in one stretch of coast. So the numbers are really probably just going to get worse. The official death toll is still at something like 1,500, but most people do genuinely expect that the final toll will be in excess of 10,000.
Hayden, we'll have to leave it there, but thanks very much for talking to us.
Thanks, Steve.
Hayden Cooper, ABC correspondent there in Tokyo. Tim, as a science journalist, you've been looking at some of the seismology issues coming out of this and also looking at the history of that. These are not isolated incidents, these earthquakes, are they? There seem to be, in the last 6 years, an increase in the number of earthquakes.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. I mean, this was a big one. This is kind of on the top end of the scale, getting up to 9.0, and the US Geological Survey are calling it 8.9. The Japanese scientists are calling it a 9. Either way, that's one of the biggest 5 earthquakes in recorded history, which is from around about 1900. But there has been a bit of a cluster of big earthquakes recently, including the one in Chile not so long ago. As well as the one in Christchurch and some other fairly significant ones. It's difficult, though. The science is unclear on exactly why they cluster in the way they do, whether it's a random distribution or whether there is a kind of a pattern going on. Certainly when you look at the movements of the tectonic plates, for example, there's no reason just looking at the tectonics why, say, the Christchurch earthquake and the Japanese earthquake would be related or would have some kind of causal link. But there's a lot we don't know. I mean, plate tectonics has only really been mainstream science for about 30 or 40 years. So there's still a hell of a lot we don't know about the cause of these things and how they're interconnected.
Excuse me. Moving on to the issue of the nuclear reactors, and we've seen 2 of the reactors go into meltdown. Now, you've written previously about thorium, which is a form of technology that could be used to stop nuclear reactors go into meltdown. Tell us about that.
Well, thorium is an alternative to a uranium nuclear power plant. And thorium is a slightly lighter element, so it has a different fuel cycle. The reason uranium was used to generate power was because it has a fuel cycle that generates byproducts that can be used for weapons, so that the nuclear weapon industry was tied into the nuclear power industry. It could produce uranium-235 and plutonium, particularly plutonium. Thorium, because it's a lighter element, you can create a nuclear reactor using thorium that cannot go critical because it's lighter, it's not fissile. So unlike uranium, you can pack a whole lot of thorium together and it's not going to have a runaway chain reaction. You're never going to get a meltdown. So if we were using this technology today, and it's been known about for quite some time, but because it's a new technology, it hasn't been adopted yet. But if, for example, these reactors in Japan were based on thorium technology, we wouldn't be having the kinds of issues that we're having at the moment.
Meredith, a lot of environmentalists want to see the expansion of nuclear energy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. What do you think this disaster, what impact will it have on the expansion of nuclear energy?
Well, I think it's interesting that you say a lot of environmentalists want to expand nuclear energy. I think it's younger environmentalists who have never dealt with the stories of my youth, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, endless wind scale in Britain, the problems of the huge problems of nuclear energy. And so I think this is, and it's terrible to have happened in the middle of this tragedy, but it is a wake-up call for those people who kept saying, look, nuclear energy is the clean, way forward, and this is what we should be doing, because they're having to face what we all faced when, 3 Mile Island happened.
But a lot of nuclear power plants are not built near earthquake zones and are a way of reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
But it is not just an earthquake that can cause these problems. I mean, 3 Mile Island was not caused by an earthquake. Chernobyl wasn't. They were just accidents inside the facility. And yes, they are becoming safer, but what the old-style environmentalists, and I would say, is they're never going to be safe enough to be able to be used for energy.
Glenn Milne, Joe Lieberman, the US Senator who chairs their committee there on Homeland Security, has said that he sees that they'll put the brakes on any nuclear expansion in the short term, at least in the US, after this.
Well, I think anybody that's opposed to nuclear energy will seize upon what's happened tragically